100 days of the coalition government. Has it been a success, a failure, or something in between? Let's find out. Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX, and thanks again for helping us to get to 150,000 subscribers. We really appreciate the support and the affirmation. My name is Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh. On this channel, SMWX, we explore South African politics through interviews and analysis. And well, the coalition government, the so-called Government of National Unity, has reached 100 days of its existence, and there will be various celebrations of this government going forward over the next little period. I want to give a review of exactly how this coalition government has performed. And in this episode, we're going to look at the failures, the successes, and the jury's still out or not so sure aspects of this government. All in all, I am still quite skeptical of the long-term success of this government, but there have been some important successes that we need to acknowledge, and there are a number of things which are still indeterminate right now. So let's try and make sense of what this coalition government has been able to achieve in its first 100 days, and I'm going to start off with the failures, because this government gets a very easy ride in the mainstream media. It's the best thing that has ever happened to South Africa. Vibes are up, sentiment is up, and largely the government can do no wrong. But I actually think that there's a need to temper that narrative and to really look with a certain steely-eyed determination at this government's actual performance. And so I think there have been a couple of failures which I want to start with. The first is just around the question of transparency and decision-making. We have no idea how this government is making decisions. We have absolutely no transparency over what document it's using, what mechanisms it's using, how decisions are going to be made. From the onset, there was some dispute and debate within the two key partners, the ANC and the DA, about what the initial coalition document even meant, whether there was sufficient consensus or whether it was possible for the ANC to leave the DA out of certain decisions. Since then, everything has gone underground, and I think there's a key problem with a coalition arrangement which governs a country where the document which governs that arrangement either is not in existence, or if we're using the old one, is disputed between the parties and we've never actually been able to reconcile those disputes. So I find it strange that we have a government that makes decisions, but the process through which it makes decisions and the way that deadlocks and disputes are governed is just not clear to the public. Hopefully, in time, as South Africa gets more used to coalition governments, and I fully appreciate that this government had a very short time period in which to constitute itself, but hopefully over time we will start to get more transparent coalition arrangements where the public can actually hold the government accountable based on a public document rather than backdoor deals and strategic leaks on either side, which only serve to cloud the judgment of the voters ultimately. So I think that there's been no transparency on that. As for this national dialogue that is supposed to be the signature of this government, announced in July by President Ramaphosa, but it's been the centerpiece of early coalition conversations, what's going on with this national dialogue? Like, when is it happening? It's 100 days into the government, and we haven't even had the dialogue that's supposed to create the policy of this government. I just don't know. I mean, the longer the time runs on, the less need for this dialogue there will be, because the government will surely have had to start working itself. I've said many times, I don't mind a dialogue. We can all come together and talk if the agenda of the dialogue is about the serious questions of inequality, of poverty, of how we drag our economy up and create independence. If we talk about South Africa's foreign policy in an increasingly changing world, if we talk about land, if we talk about jobs, if we talk about education, if we talk about healthcare, and if we talk about the fundamental problem of democratic South Africa to deliver for its people, cool. I'm all for a conversation like that, but it should happen urgently and soon, especially if it's going to be the bedrock of a future policy platform. So I just don't know what's going on with this dialogue, who's leading it, who's running it. I know there's a civil society dialogue that's happening, which sounds cool, where various foundations are coming together, and that's fine, but that's not the same as the national one where the government is going to participate and lead. So I just don't know what's going on with this national dialogue, and it seems to be thrown out there as something that will keep GNU partners together, but we just haven't seen it. It's just nowhere to be seen. Another concern that I think has been raised over this coalition government is policy coherence, because at the end of the day, a government governs to set and implement policy. Government doesn't govern to create sentiment and vibes. It decides things and it implements them. And at every major turn, barring a few exceptions, it seems to me that this coalition has just not agreed on key policies. We can start with BELA, the Basic Education Laws Amendment Act. Clearly, the ANC completely disregarded the DA's views. Now, of course, BELA actually passed through Parliament before this coalition came about. But the fact of the matter is that the DA has said, and John Steenhuisen in a recent speech said, BELA is a red line. The implementation of that act is a red line for the DA. The ANC says they're definitely pushing ahead. So what will happen there? It's clear that there is a potentially irreconcilable difference on policy when it comes to education. We haven't got to higher education, free education, the NSFAS funding model, and all of that, which is probably coming down the line early next year. As far as Dr. John Hlophe's presence on the JSC, we saw a break and a split there again. The DA didn't want him to sit. The ANC voted for him to be a member of the JSC. Now, subsequent litigation has barred him from serving, and he has then resigned. But the fact of the matter is that the two key partners, the ANC and the DA, again, were not able to see eye to eye on that policy question. And this is something that I did foreground as this GNU was coming together, that there would be tests. And I don't think this government has been fully tested yet. Maybe that's to its credit as well. But when big tests and unforeseen tests emerge, that's the true test of policy coherence. And so far, this government has been quite incoherent, at least the coalition partners of the ANC and the DA. On the question of whether they even describe themselves as a GNU, there is dissent. I have to stan Helen Zille, who literally for months, whenever she is asked, she basically says this is not a GNU. I saw Aldrin Sampear on Newsroom Africa interviewing her recently. Shout out to Aldrin as well. And I also saw an interview with Zille and Heidi Jokos on ENCA, a very interesting interview where Zille was asked, is this a GNU or not? And bear in mind, we're into October now. And she was like, well, we can call it a GNU if we want to, basically. She was like, the parties have agreed to call it a GNU. But she also said you can do the math. And if you do the math, it's not a GNU. So the parties actually haven't even agreed yet on what kind of coalition this is. Obviously, the ANC is very keen to describe this as a GNU because then they make the coalition government synonymous with the nation. And if you criticize the government, you are criticizing the nation. So they want to get the kudos that comes from this being a national unity government, when in actual fact, it's not in truth. But what I'm particularly interested in now is that the parties don't agree on what it is. Then you've got the question of that is coming down the line of the funding of state-owned enterprises. Now, the ANC government has been quite clear that it will continue to give lifelines to state-owned enterprises. It has pumped billions into SAA, for example. The DA says this is another red line. They will not support any further bailouts. So again, that budget is going to be very interesting to see whether the parties can come to an agreement there. Again, policy coherence or incoherence. NHI, need I touch on that? Need I touch on questions of reserve bank ownership? I think the parties will come together there because I think they largely agree. The DA says that's another red line for them. But then you have the question of foreign policy. Now, all seems rosy in the garden at the moment. But the prospect of a regional conflict in the Middle East, I think, could well, again, split this coalition government. We know that the DA is largely Israel-leaning in its foreign policy outlook. It's pro-Western, whereas the ANC adopts a much more non-aligned position and has been very critical of Israel's actions in Gaza, where the International Court of Justice has already said that at the very least there's a plausible case for genocide. So we know that those two are fundamentally at odds when it comes to Middle Eastern foreign policy. Now, if that conflict escalates into a larger war, which it has already started to do between Israel and Iran, centered largely around Israel's actions in Gaza, that is going to create large-scale, shall we say, debate within the GNU, quote unquote, because the Patriotic Alliance, the Freedom Front Plus, the DA, and the IFP have a pro-Israel foreign policy, whereas the ANC and some of the other much smaller parties are largely pro-Palestinian at the very least, and maybe non-aligned in other contexts. Same is true for the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where the GNU and some of the other partners are clearly pro-Ukraine, whereas the ANC adopts a more non-aligned stance, but also has ties to Russia through BRICS. And BRICS itself is going to be key. But I'm doing a whole video on the Middle Eastern conflict and how it's going to come to bear on South African politics, so look out for that. Safe to say that as far as the key policy questions are concerned, this government has not yet found its voice. Now, there's low-hanging fruit, and of course, potholes need to be fixed, and infrastructure needs to be upgraded, and water needs to be delivered, etc. But when it comes to key policy choices, I have not been convinced that the coalition partners have been able to find each other. If anything, there has been a dialogue of the deaf, in my view, between the two, ANC and DA. And quite frankly, the smaller parties don't really have the ability to sway policy one way or the other. So I think in terms of policy and coherence, we have a serious challenge with this government right now. But apparently, according to News 24 reporting, there's going to be a clearinghouse for policy conversations. The fact that this has only happened 100 days into this government is stunning to me. But so the structure hasn't been set up, but there will be some kind of structure where the parties themselves will iron things out. But merely setting up a structure doesn't guarantee that that structure is going to agree. That may just delay or paralyze policy decisions further. So I'm yet to see a policy decision on which the ANC and the DA have come together and said, we're going to compromise on this. And particularly, I haven't seen the ANC compromising. The ANC knows that it can just steam ahead, maybe even get the support of the EFF and the MK when they need it, and just disregard the DA's policy desires. So let's see what happens. Let's come now to part two, which is the successes of this government, because I think there have been a few. And I would actually argue that the biggest success of this government has been the load shedding situation. Now, Minister Kgosientsho Ramaphosa came in and I think has done an incredible job in stabilizing the energy supply situation. Of course, he was helped to the extent that demand started falling and South Africans started just basically coming up with their own solutions. But it's pretty clear that the available supply of electricity, what they call the energy availability factor coming out of our power stations, is where we want it to be, and we have sufficient supply at the moment to meet our demand. And that is fantastic, because if you remember this time last year, the country was literally on its knees because of load shedding. Like we were praying for stage 4 at some point, right? So yes, the government, the ANC government, managed to stabilize things just before the election. But continuing that stability is a success of this government. And we can't take it away from the government. So I think the GNU, so-called, has benefited greatly from the constant electricity supply, because if it faced bouts of load shedding while it was setting itself up, that would have been a recipe for disaster. So I think on the energy side of the ledger, the GNU has done really well. And of course, for obvious reasons, that's central and key to the economy. What the GNU has also done well is obviously perpetuate itself or constitute itself. And it has survived these 100 days. And that's not necessarily a small thing, because it wasn't clear whether this government would be able to actually hold. How long it will hold, I'm not sure, but it has constituted itself. It has divided portfolios in a way that seems to have satisfied the different parties. I'm quite surprised that the DA was satisfied with so little, but it seems to be happy. And cabinet is moving, cabinet is meeting. We've seen cross-cabinet initiatives between ministers, and the government clearly has established itself and is surviving and is moving forward. So any predictions that it would implode, before these 100 days have been put paid to. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. So the third success of this government, I'm not so sure is the government's alone or actually belongs to the government, but hey, it's benefited from it. It's created a certain sentiment, particularly in financial markets, that has benefited the South African economy. So the yield on 10-year bonds has fallen to below 10. It was rising up until 11. What that basically means is that government debt is no longer as expensive. People have more faith in the government being able to service those bonds than they did before, and therefore the price of those bonds has gone down. And that's usually a good long-term sign on international confidence in a government. It was rising in bad times during the South African economic experience recently, and it has started falling. Now, just to be around 9 is not necessarily amazing. It has fallen before. And we've seen yields on 10-year bonds fall, particularly at the start of the first Ramaphosa administration. So it's largely based on sentiment. And then when that government failed to deliver, they skyrocketed up after COVID and then through the load shedding crisis. But the fact of the matter is bond yields have fallen, which is cool, which is great. The second thing is the exchange rate has strengthened against key currencies, especially the dollar. And that's also an indicator that foreign financial markets, even some domestic sentiment around the economy is strong, is higher than it was before. The JSE at various points has rallied and seems to be having a good time. So those people, rich people who own stocks in South African companies are living their best right now. So there's been a decent 100-day period for particularly market sentiment in the country. Now, market sentiment matters, but it matters in the short term only insofar as it is an indicator of an underlying economic reality. And so that's what this coalition government will have to prove, that those who have bet on this government based on improved sentiment made the right bet. And not like when we saw market sentiment rallying around 2018, placed their bets and then realized that those bets were actually wrong. But to create a certain market environment is an achievement of this government, and President Ramaphosa's coalition government have created the kind of sentiment that will lead the economy in a positive direction. So having said that, I want to now come on to some of the things that are neither successes nor failures, but we should keep an eye on as we go forward. So the first thing is, as I say, the real economy, the economy itself, unemployment, poverty, inequality. Because that's ultimately what matters to the South African citizen, right? It's all well and good to have financial markets soaring, but at the end of the day, is the economy actually growing? Is unemployment actually falling? Is inequality actually going backwards? Are houses actually being built? Are people actually getting healthcare? Are people actually getting educated? Is infrastructure actually improving? Are informal settlements falling? Are people getting access to formal housing, etc.? Is racism on the decline? Is violent crime going down, etc.? So it's these realities right at the heart of society and the economy, that I don't know what to make of yet, because it's too early to tell whether this government is actually moving forward or not. There's a lot of PR, there's a lot of celebration, there are a lot of press conferences, there are a lot of press statements. But when I look at the raw economic data, firstly, it's very early, so we don't have a lot of that data. But unemployment doesn't seem to be doing much. And there's this goal of 3% economic growth. Now, in actual fact, we need about 6%, according to the government's own estimates, to really strike a blow to any of these major indicators. But 3%, of course, would be better than we've seen in a long time, probably 5 years. But the government's own forecasts are about 1.6% growth over the next 3 years. So I think one key indicator would be, do we get over, let's say, 1.5% growth in a given year? If we hit 1.5% when, the growth numbers for this year come out early next year, or if we look at quarterly growth figures and we're trending upwards, that'll be a good sign. But at present, it's not clear to me that there's anything at the heart of the real economy which is fundamentally changing. So obviously 3% would be very good, whereas less than 1.5% would be a big disappointment. So I think that's a key indicator to look out for. Then you've got unemployment. And quite frankly, it's horrific. The first Ramaphosa administration for unemployment was just terrifying. Like, it just kept climbing up and beating world record after world record. And we're just nowhere close to resolving that crisis. So again, can we at least get it down from the record highs first? And then, it would be nice for this government to set a target that we can hold it to. We haven't got that kind of detail on policy yet. But clearly we would need to see unemployment and then inequality. And I would also add violent crime, because violent crime is on the increase, and that's a serious cause for concern. So we don't know yet whether the sentiment, which is positive, is being supported by a fundamental shift in the actual governance picture. The energy security picture seems to be much better, which is excellent. But in terms of other important indicators, we simply don't have enough information yet to make up our minds. So this has been a review of the first 100 days of the Government of National Unity. I am not as bullish on this government as many other people are, but I acknowledge it also has defied some of its detractors, and I think the jury is largely still out for me at this stage. What I would like to conclude on is a recent SRF, Social Research Foundation poll, and I do think I take those numbers quite seriously, even though a lot of people dismiss polling in South Africa, because it proved to be pretty accurate before the election. Now, they've done a poll based on a 58% turnout model in terms of political party support, comparing what happened in the election and where things stand now. And according to this poll, the ANC's made a significant recovery from just under 40 to 45. The DA has improved marginally from the early 20s to about 24. And the MK and the EFF have both declined, with the IFP and the Patriotic Alliance seeing marginal gains. So why I think this is important is, in order for this GNU to hold together, all of the parties that are in this arrangement need to do well simultaneously. And especially the ANC and the DA need to do well, because when we have our local government elections, either in 2026 or 2027, if the ANC is seen to be gaining at the expense of the DA, then that will make the political logic of remaining in the coalition less sound for the DA. And similarly, if the DA grows but the ANC continues to fall, then we could see the voices in the ANC which say this was a bad idea, we told you so, growing. So both the ANC and the DA have to do well electorally for this coalition to stick together. And if the early polling is to be believed, that actually seems to be materializing, which to me would suggest that the GNU arrangement would persist beyond the 2026 election. But it's still very early, and various things can happen in the body politic. But if that trend continues, then I think that's likely to reinforce the government sticking together, because the electorate would effectively be saying, keep going, we like what we're seeing from all of you. Keep going in this direction. However, if those numbers begin to fall, particularly for either the ANC or the DA, obviously if it's for both of them, then that's catastrophic. Then I think we will see cracks beginning to emerge within this government. That's all for now. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Let me know what you think down below. You don't have to agree or disagree. We are a healthy platform for debate. What do you think the successes and the failures and those things in between have been for this government? Like, share, subscribe. Road to 200K starts now. And thanks for joining us again on SMWX. It's great to have you with us. Aye.